Good afternoon, and welcome back to the Regulatory Training Initiative course on the Introduction to the Theory and Practice of Regulation. Today we have a very exciting class. We have Sue Tierney talking about the coming utility transition. Before I introduce Dr. Tierney, let me go through some housekeeping. During the course of the lecture, you'll be able to ask questions. We will address those questions at the end, but please feel free to submit the questions as we go along. And between you and I, it's a lot less frantic if you do so than if they all come in at the end and we have to go through them and ask them. This way we can do a little bit of preparation before the end of the class. We're really lucky to have Dr. Tierney join us today. She has a tremendous experience within the regulated utility industry. She has her PhD in regional science from Cornell University, and she then went to work for the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities, where she ended up becoming a commissioner. Again, very much like Diane Munns, when we talked about the path to commissioner, becoming staff and proving your mettle that way is certainly one path to doing that. After she was at the Mass Department of Public Utilities, she was the Assistant Secretary for Policy at the Department of Energy. By the way, she was also the Secretary of Environmental Affairs for Massachusetts. Tremendous background. She's with the Analysis Group now, a very fine consulting firm that works on the economics of regulation, where she works on issues of energy and environmental and economic regulation and policy associated with the electric utility industry and other regulated industries. It's my pleasure to introduce Sue Tierney to you, and I look forward to your questions that we will address. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. It's such a pleasure to be here. And I wish I could see your faces because we need that these days. I'm here to talk about the coming utility transition, and I thought I would borrow from Charles Dickens' slide because it seems apt for the moment that we are in time in 2020. It's just been such a tough year. There are so many transitions and multiple simultaneous crises underway. You know them very well. I don't need to spend time today going on, but it is a time of a lot of challenges. We owe a lot to the essential workers out there in our communities, people who have been in the hospitals, people who have kept grocery stores full, and delivery companies and so forth. But also essential workers are those who have been spending time making sure that we get utility service. Can you imagine if you did not have electricity during this period of time? Can you imagine if you couldn't wash your hands because you didn't have water service at this time? If you could not communicate, just as we are today, over the internet or with your friends and family on your phones, it would just be an impossible situation. Certainly people live like that in many parts of the country, but Americans are mainly not used to that kind of environment. So it makes me reflect upon the important role that the people in our industry and their regulators have been doing to make sure that we are okay at this period of time. So there are some challenges in our industry, even though there are lots of opportunities, and I'm going to talk about those, some of those challenges and opportunities for the rest of my presentation. I'm going to talk about some of these utility transitions, and some of these are not such new issues. Some of them are old, but I think they're important ones in 2020 and looking ahead for where the industry is going. So I'm going to talk a little bit about competition and regulation. I'm going to talk about access and affordability of basic utility service, because I think those two top issues, competition versus affordability, they in some ways are kind of joined at the hip. I'm going to talk about the upcoming capital requirements that are facing the industry and therefore facing customers in terms of paying for those capital investments. I'm going to talk about the electric and other energy transitions, all associated with clean energy and lowering the carbon footprint. I'm going to talk about the gas delivery infrastructure as part of that clean energy transition. And then finally, I'm going to talk about cooperative federalism, the role of the federal, regions, and states in the business that we are in today. Finally, the last word will be some brief words about innovation. These are not the only issues, of course. This is not a comprehensive survey, but I think these are important issues for regulators to take into consideration. Let me talk to you for a few minutes about the fundamental challenge that has always been there in utility regulation associated with regulation itself in competition. I don't need to spend much time talking to you about the transformations that took place over the last 30 years in wholesale markets that were really pushed by law and regulation and enabled by economic and technological changes. Those have resulted in, the development of regional transmission organizations and a lot of incentives for innovation and so forth, and efficiencies on the wholesale market side. Now, you may be very interested in particular with what's happening with regulation versus competition at the retail level. There's growing pressure from technology, innovation, and economics, distributed energy resources, demand response, microgrids, local storage capabilities. And in some cases, those are driven by state policies, such as net energy metering, as well as federal tax incentives and so forth. So there are lots of challenges for regulators, as well as opportunities for consumers and suppliers. The discussions that really matter from a regulatory point of view are, what do you do to maintain aspects of the industry that cannot be workably competitive? And what do you need to do to enable competition to occur where it can occur? So that might address utility franchise rules, the ability of the utility to participate in providing services like community solar, where in theory other parties could be doing that as well. It might be involved with seeing what kind of service offerings a utility can provide to its customers, even knowing that those service offerings might be something that somebody else could provide as well. So these are very important questions. They're very important for customers who are agitating for change. They're very important for customers who are remaining on the grid, who are not able to take advantage of some of those new technological options. And these are very important for considerations of the utility's health, their financial health, making sure that the people who are not leaving the system to take advantage of these are not absorbing the costs of carrying the whole system that is supporting everybody. So there's a lot of important questions here, and I know that these are going to be on your agenda going forward. So one of the issues then that I want to talk further about is, what does that kind of mean for the affordability of utility service? What you see here are the average household's expenditures on different basic utility services over the last 10 years. These are not stacked bars, so you see that today an average household spends about $1,600 a year on electricity and about the same for phone. So if these were stacked, of course, you would see much higher, and you would see that over in 2019, all of those services together cost around $4,000 for an average household. Now, you see that those bars are pretty flat. These are in real dollar terms, so they're inflation adjusted. And you can see that electricity has actually gone down in terms of a customer bill. an average customer bill. Phone is about the same, amazingly enough. Water, we see ticking up very slowly. And gas, of course, because gas commodity service has been getting cheaper in the last decade. We see a lot of just basically pretty constant prices in these different fields, different sectors. So in fact, households' incomes, average household income has gone up during a period of time. 10 years ago, 6% of household income was spent on these services. It's just about 5% today. And these are much less than housing. Housing today would be about $20,000 a year, transportation, $10,000 a year, food, $8,000 a year. So it's kind of amazing that utility service, which is so essential for everything in life today in the United States, has kept pretty well under control. The however is that there are burdens on the poor associated with these utility services. So this time you do see these utility service expenditures stacked in a bar, and you can see those bars going up over time. And what those represent are, for each 10% of the income spectrum, lowest 10% on the right, highest 10% on, I said that wrong, lowest 10% on the left, highest income on the right, you see that that people are spending more when they have more money to spend. So these are in absolute dollar terms using that left-hand key. And it shows, the average very, very low income customer is going to spend about $2,000. The average customer over $200,000 in income is going to spend almost $6,000 a year on these basic services. But you can see when you look at the percentage of the household's after-tax income that the burden on the poor is quite large. The very poorest customers over here below the poverty line are spending above 15% of their income, total income, on utility services. That's a huge percentage, and it drops down even though those customers on the right-hand side of your screen are taking advantage of the fact that they can spend more on electricity and gas and phones and so forth. It's a small percentage of their income. Those customers on the right-hand side of the screen are the ones most likely to be able to take advantage of grid edge technologies too. And so when I mentioned a few minutes ago that one of the challenges in the industry is making sure that as people peel off some of their purchases of utility service, especially electricity, that they are contributing to keeping the grid available and keeping it available for everybody. And if that were not the case, and they were in some sense free riding on the grid, then the burden on the poor would be much higher than you see here today. So let's talk about another issue, which is that the industries, these basic utilities, are going to have a very large capital horizon in the future. That's true for water. The American Water Works Association continues to find that aging infrastructure is the highest priority in that industry, and the capital raising implications of addressing it are the second highest issue in that industry. So that's undoubtedly going to put pressure on water rates. Natural gas has lots of old and leaky pipes in the ground, and they require operations and maintenance expenditures for safety, security, for environmental reasons. This is happening at the same time that there's increased pressure for controlling how much future spending fossil energy companies put out in terms of capital additions, especially if there is pressure for decarbonizing these energy industries. So that's clearly, this capital challenge is going to be difficult in the gas industry. I'll come back to this point later on. And electricity, think about the extent to which half of the country still needs to have advanced meters. The fact that with electrification of end uses that use natural gas or propane right now, or even gasoline in cars, that will lead to a bigger electric system with a larger need for capital investment in on the generation, transmission, and distribution side. So these are key issues for maintaining affordability and maintaining the need to make sure that people see prices that recover these costs, but that maintain that affordability element in the end. So there's the balance sheet. You know and love it well. I know from the rate cases, it's important to make sure, as I say, that that is a healthy balance sheet, not because I'm interested in seeing utility profits go great and customers squeezed, but balance sheets are necessary to afford this capital deployment that's going to be necessary in the next years. So there's a lot of energy transitions underway in terms of the supply portfolio. Now, the telecom industry went through these transitions over the last 30 years. Profound technological, structural, economic, regulatory changes, legal changes have taken place over the last 4 decades. It's hardly the industry that I recognize compared to when I was a utility regulator back in the day. But today, you know, 96% of Americans own a cell phone. The lowest percentage of that group are people over 65. 81% of Americans have a smartphone, and that's up from 1/3 of Americans in 2011. So there's been enormous, you know, innovation with applications, devices, service offerings, and so forth. And in much of the states, 40 of the states, there is virtually no or very limited regulation of landline services today as a result of those changes. But the changes in the electric industry are just staggering in terms of the things that are underway. As you know very well, there's lots of cost-effective, low-carbon, and renewable technologies. Wind and solar, of course, have seen cost reductions that have blown my mind in some sense over the last 15 years. 2/3 of the states are very interested in seeing much more reliance on those renewable energy resources. So we're seeing a big transition in generation portfolios. The percentage of coal in the mix keeps going down year after year. The carbon footprint is going down year after year, but it's got to accelerate if the carbon reduction targets are going to move faster, consistent with what the scientific community has told us is necessary to limit the worst effects of climate change. So big transitions are underway. And even though these are on the generation side, and in some sense part of wholesale markets that are federally regulated, there are a lot of really interesting and important issues for state utility regulators. Local interconnection of distributed energy resources to allow them to develop, rate designs to move past net energy metering, and other ways to provide different service and price offerings to consumers who have very different profiles. The providers of supply, what's the role of the utility versus competitive third-party suppliers? How are you going to think about utilities' interests and reliance on unconventional technologies as those begin to emerge in future years from the technological research bench? There's going to be some first and second and third examples of some of those new technologies. They'll need regulatory mechanisms to allow them to come into the market, and there's going to be really interesting questions for regulators to address those. And finally, down there on the left, you see a natural gas power plant. We're likely to see a lot of tensions going forward if utilities want to retire coal plants in some parts of the country, and they have limitations on their ability to import renewables from different parts of the country. They may need to add gas-fired capacity in order to keep the lights on a 24/7 basis. But that's going to hit a very difficult situation in energy facility siting proceedings that you will be addressing over the next year. Very important questions to pay attention to coming forward. Now, changing demand profiles, of course, are happening in parallel. Electric vehicles are being charged at homes and in commercial buildings, government buildings, and so forth. Solar panels on roofs are lowering consumers' loads during certain periods of the day. Lots of smart applications that you can control from your mobile devices, and even heat pumps over there will change the load profiles for customers in buildings around the country. So there's a lot of changing elements of a demand profile. What you see here is a household in Austin, Texas. This is the Pecan Street project. And this is a household between 5 p.m. and midnight. Let's just say it's a typical day. And what you see here are the demands on the grid associated with different electricity end uses. So that big orange and red set of bars, that's your heating and cooling systems that are kicking on and off with compressors and then just operating during those periods of time. And then they kick off for some periods of time as well. The next biggest on here are things like your dishwasher that's going to be on for a period of time, or some of the heating and cooling or lighting systems over the course of the day. As I said a minute ago, for the energy bills, the utility bills, these are not stacked bars. These are, so if you actually stacked up these different end uses, they would add to higher profiles of electricity going to this house as seen by the grid. Now, what happens when this customer adds an electric vehicle and wants to charge it? So this is between, I think, 2 p.m. and midnight, so 2 p.m. on the left. You still see heating and cooling back there doing a lot of yeoman's work from the grid. And then you also see the electric charging. When that customer comes home, that household member comes home and starts charging their vehicle, it's going to compete and add to almost double the amount of electricity that that house is going to be using and present to the grid. So it's going to make huge differences. So I'm going to add one final picture, which is what's happening to that customer if that customer has solar panels. So let's assume there's electric vehicles, there's a lot of electric appliances in the house, heating and cooling is electricity, and they have solar panels. And this is the famous duck curve that you've seen before in California, where it's viewed as a system load profile. In this case, this is a house. And this actually happens to be a set of load profiles of a house, again, in the Pecan Street project, where it's in the COVID era. So the lines that are at the bottom indicate that that customer is, let's say the gray line, that's the beginning of March 2020. And between midnight and midnight of that day, solar radiation is coming on powerfully around noon. So you see a lot of solar output is being essentially offset by uses of electricity in that house. So the grid sees a net amount which is really low, as you know. The green and dark blue lines are different weeks in March, and those are weeks when the COVID stay home was starting to happen. And that, oh, excuse me, the orange line is the one I really want to call your attention to. And in that case, that begins to be a period of time when people are at home, they're using electric appliances. It may be a week that did not have as much solar radiation, which is why the belly is pretty shallow there. And so you see a lot of variation in that grid associated with different appliances, different behaviors in that household, and electrification, both of vehicles, but in this case, solar panels that are sometimes available and not always available to provide electricity to this household and the grid. So you see the key that I should have shown you earlier. Just one more thing about these changing demand profiles. And the reason I'm going through all of this is because it does relate to what challenges local distribution utilities will be facing going forward as they plan to make sure that they can handle loads 24/7, but also what kind of rate designs and planning and support for investments that regulators should be thinking about. Now, this case is an example of flexible demand. The top is a house, again, in the Pecan Street area, where they're taking 15-minute intervals associated with electricity use. And this cooling loads only. The bottom panel shows a house with demand response. And what you see is the peak in each of those cycles went down. And actually, I think this is over the course of a week, and I do apologize for that. I had suggested these were dailies. These are daily over 7 days. But you see with demand response that those customers at the bottom, that house, can shave off its peak. It went from just below 4 kW to just below 3 kW as a peak. And there are periods of time when there's no energy use coming out of it compared to the house without demand response. So here's another look at this same situation. This is over the course of a couple of days. And you see that household peak demand going up and down over the course of people turning lights on and off and going to sleep and so forward. But you see with demand response, the green, which was the pre-demand response peak, that household had a peak demand of just under 12 kW. But with demand response, they were able to shave it down by a fourth. So imagine this household had a rate design with a large fixed demand charge. They would be able to shave that demand charge by shaving their peak and managing it in different ways. So this is actual house, actual data. So other part of an energy transition I just previewed a minute ago, and that is that the system is going to see a lot of changes in terms of how it operates and how it must be planned. So you see here the full supply chain over there on the left. You see, and down at the bottom, you see power plant generators. They're hooked together through this network shown in green here, which is high voltage transmission. You see some storage down there on the bottom. And then on the local distribution grid, you see a number of things that are new and very important in this new world. These are, excuse me, I can't even read my own. These are sensors on the system, I apologize. Sensors on the distribution wires so that there's much better visibility to the local grid operator about what's coming and going in different power flows on the system. There are processors to connect those sensors, analyze the data quite quickly, and enable grid operators to respond where it's needed. Demand response is a new element of this that will be needed again to manage the grid. There's also all sorts of smart applications. And so this is a system that is incredibly more complex than it has been in the past. You have to think of every one of those elements as a number of complexities that help the system operators do their job, but also that create a lot of dynamic changes on this local grid in ways that are very different than in the past, and it's only going to become more so in the future. So I think you need to pay attention to this. Utilities will need to understand these data and the trends in order to plan to make sure that they have enough supply. Going back to those pictures I showed you a few minutes ago of those demand profiles of different households, imagine if on a single circuit, let's say the one that I'm showing over there on the right of this picture, let's say that everybody is plugging in their electric vehicle at the same time and the circuit can't handle it. So there's a disturbance on that grid. There may be disruptions of service just generally, and you want to avoid that, of course, by making sure that the utility plans and addresses that in anticipation of those things going on in the future, and making sure that costs are allocated properly between those who are providing services to the grid and those who are not only doing that, but taking advantage in good ways of having the grid connects them to everybody else. So let me spend a minute now on natural gas and the implications for the local gas distribution system for a low carbon energy transition. Right now, buildings, commercial and residential buildings, are about 12% of greenhouse gas emissions. Most of the emissions, of course, are from in the power sector. Increasingly, they are from the transportation sector. And fossil fuel use in buildings is a pretty small percentage. Most of that is natural gas. On average, 60% of local gas distribution utilities sales are to these buildings. So it's a big deal compared to their sales to industry and to power plants. That's the LDC sales. Now, fuel consumption in buildings is dominated by natural gas. That's the orange in that picture. 3/4 of gas sales are to these buildings, at least for investor-owned utilities. And if you anticipate that there will be a push for electricity for heating systems and appliances in natural gas buildings, what are you going to think about as you look for the advantages associated with more efficient buildings, because electric equipment is more efficient, lower greenhouse gas emissions, but there's going to be cost shifts, and those are going to come onto your platter if they haven't already begun to do so. So here's the gas supply chain. Over there on the left are the commodity parts of the business. So production and processing of natural gas. We'll just move that over. That's the competitive part of the business. In the middle of this is the pipeline system, the interstate pipeline system regulated by FERC. And on the right-hand side is the local gas distribution system that's going to be providing service to these buildings, some bus fleets, some manufacturers, and so forth. So let's see what happens. Let's say you want to have a residential customer electrify their home. As long as there are other customers on that gas pipeline circuit, and by the way, this is not a network. This is a pipes and wires world. This is not like the electric system. Everybody on that, street of the pipeline system over there on the right is served off of this particular pipeline system. And in this case, it's the LDC. The LDC takes service at the city gate metering station from specific pipelines. So if that residential customer no longer is taking gas service, the gas utility still has to maintain those pipes in order to provide service for everybody else. And if you think all the way back to the end of the system, at least the fixed asset part of the system, the interstate pipeline, they too need to keep the system maintained and safely operated, even as people start peeling off because they are electrifying. That raises challenges, as you can imagine, because unless you're in a situation where everyone on that circuit, so in this picture, let's assume that X is on a neighborhood street where there are 20 customers, and they are, the gas company has to keep the system maintained. They have to, rip up the streets occasionally to provide good service and so forth. Let's say that entire section of the city was electrified. You might imagine that the utility could then avoid future capital additions for that portion of the system, but the capital that was spent in the past and is not yet depreciated is still got to be recovered from the customer base. And you can probably imagine where I'm going with this. There are scenarios associated with the speed and location of electrification where you see fewer and fewer people remaining on the system and their rates going up as they continue to have to support a safely operating system going forward. So at some point, people need to start thinking very creatively about how these rate impact and rate shifts issues are going to occur. Again, because at least in the near term, because there is a cost premium for a consumer who electrifies from a gas building to an all-electric building, let's say through retrofit, the people who are least likely to leave first are low-income consumers. So there will be affordability issues here that are very important for the LDC and for customers and for the regulator. Now, just two more topics. Federal-state cooperation. The energy transitions we've talked about, they're underway, they're enormous change. You see on the left, the states representing the majority of the population in the United States. They represent states that have firm commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It's a lot. Interestingly, this is the footprint of the service territories of utilities, electric utilities, that have already made greenhouse gas emission commitments. I'm going to say that right. Greenhouse gas emission reduction commitments. It's a huge portion of the United States. Now let's think about regional issues in these two maps. First, where are some high quality renewables? You see where they are located. That doesn't mean you can't get solar power up there in Massachusetts or in Washington State, just not as often and not as deeply and so forth. There is wind in the offshore areas of the mid-Atlantic. Of course, it's not shown on this map, but these really high quality wind and solar resources are going to be places where you want to be able to develop those renewables in order to control costs associated with them. Again, I'm overstating the case because there will be a lot of distributed and local resource development too. So where do people live? People live, except let's say in the, kind of the Sun Belt area, California, the Southwest, the sunny Southwest. There's not a lot of people who live where it's really windy, and a lot of people live over there on the Eastern Interconnection side of the United States, where the height of those spikes is the density of the population. So getting these resources to where people live is going to be a challenge because the transportation system for electricity that we have in place today was not built for this. There is that system. That system was built for yesterday's power plants and yesterday's loads and today's. So whatever you have at a particular point in time, there's of course some forward runway in the capacity additions. But there's still that huge part of the country, that middle part of the country, where the network is quite weak compared to the potential demands that could be in place if that electric system were built out. So I encourage you to, as regulators who are very interested in ensuring that you have access to low cost, high quality renewables, that you have the ability to try to shape your utilities portfolios so that they are diverse and again, cost effective, that you take a look at and participate actively in regional planning processes associated with grid additions. And I encourage you to think about ways to design cost allocation proposals that work for you, sometimes as a host of a facility that might be crossing your state, but also as a beneficiary because you're connected to an interstate grid that keeps the lights on. So these are the planning organizations and the power markets. The transmission planning organizations in regions on the left are very important under FERC regulations for looking ahead and doing what-if planning for transmission. Stay actively involved in these because eventually proposals may come your way for siting. And the right-hand side shows the electricity markets that are underway, again, FERC regulated. And even in the gray parts of the country, there are indications of growing participation, at least in the Western energy imbalance market, and the potential to set up an electric power market like that in the Southeast. These markets too are important to states. You everyone that's already connected in these regional wholesale markets is drawing power for your customers through efficient dispatch. That's very important for, again, affordability of service in your state. And again, it's another reason why I encourage state regulators who are looking at proposals for transmission lines to pay special attention to the extent to which you are relying on regional markets to temper your cost horizons in this market. My last point is on innovation. All those transitions have happened in part because of innovations in the past. There's huge research, development, deployment activities going on among scientists. All indications are that there will be a lot of support for continued investment in innovation for the power sector, especially to address the carbon emission footprint of the industry while keeping power available from a bigger power system on a 24/7 basis. So the industry needs to think about investments in R&D. I think regulators need to think about how much they're going to depend upon the fruits of that investment and allow cost recovery through sometimes different metrics than have been used in the past, because they're really important industry challenges ahead. I think there's innovation in policy as well. So many of the states have really been experimenting with smart grid activities, pilots, and so forth. But there's a lot more innovation. For example, Peter Fox-Penner talked to you a lot about business model innovation. So there's a lot of work to be done on the social science part and the economic part and legal part of the regulators' work. And I encourage you to address ways to kickstart different parts of the market. I mean, I think of net energy metering as the perfect example of this, where it was a mechanism, has been a mechanism that has powerfully introduced incentives for consumers to adopt solar panel. And that helped to drive down the cost of solar PVs all around the country. Just an amazing story. You might think about the transitions that are now appropriate as higher and higher penetrations of people adopt PV systems. And there's an old concept associated with sunsetting different policies when they've served their purpose and you need to move on to other things. So this last point is just simply to remind you that there is huge opportunity in this industry. The challenges are very big. You're up to the task, and I wish you all the luck. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Sue. That was wonderful. We apologize for the glitches at the beginning. As we've told you all in the past, we're all learning as we go along, and Sue had pre-taped this, and we had a couple of issues, but we're happy we restarted it and had the whole lecture before you. You mentioned balance sheets, and I just want to use that as an opportunity to let folks know that we're planning on doing a course on an introduction to accounting and utility finance in December, where we'll be discussing balance sheets, and we'll get everybody more information on that. So, but we're starting to get questions, and let me begin by addressing the first question. Do you see the eventual adoption of salt molten reactors in the future as the path forward for the efficient use of nuclear power?
Well, you started with a softball question for sure.
It is what it is. We get what we get.
Exactly. Well, whoever that pesky person is who asked that question, I guess what I would say is I am aware of a number of different important work streams, including salt and molten reactor technologies. I don't know which one of these is going to be the horse to bet on. I think it's probably too early to say that. I say that assuming that there will be at some point some nuclear technologies that through changes in business models, through changes in regulatory systems, through changes in technology like this, where there are protective systems associated with the actual character of power production and combustion of the fuel that are going to make nuclear a possibility in the future. But it's going to be after my lifetime is over, I'm afraid, and I plan on living a long time.
Well, I'm glad to hear the end of that. So you talked about regulatory innovation, and it seems to me right now that what we have is a lot of siloing of federal versus state regulation. Is there some sort of path that you can see towards a coevolution to more integrate federal and state regulation, or is that something that you think is not, maybe not needed, or the sort of the Attleboro bright line still makes sense?
That's a very good question, and I'm not just trying to bow to the head of NRRI when I say that. There's lots of different angles of it. It seems to me there seems to be a lot of hesitance to entertain different changes in Congress to the Federal Power Act that would shift the jurisdictional splits between states and the federal government. I'm probably going to say something heretical here on the call, on the phone, excuse me, on the screen. As I think about the future decarbonized big electric system, I think that states either need to step up in a very big way to think about transmission siting differently, or at some point there really may need to be some different split between the states and the feds with regard to transmission. It's going to be a challenge, and I don't know that the nation can get to a decarbonized system that's affordable without adding new wires. When I first heard your question, though, and you mentioned silos, my first thought was in states and in the federal government, the dockets are siloed. So you have a least cost planning docket, and you have a rate case docket, and any variety of other kinds of things. And often, from a participant's point of view, let's say somebody who's interested in being part of these dialogues, you have to pay attention to one thing or another, and there's typically not a mechanism in which the ramifications of one thing or another across those dockets is handled by regulators. I think that's a challenge because there's just so many of the important regulatory issues that are, either the character of the generation profile or the rate design that's going to be coming in another case. Those things matter in terms of how the system operates and how customers respond to the system and suppliers respond. So I actually think there's a lot of good work that state regulators could do, also FERC, to figure out how to consolidate some of those dockets so that or at least link them in some ways so that parties who want to participate don't have to do them all in one off, and you get inefficiencies and you get sometimes dysfunctionalities as a result of those siloed approaches. My 2 cents on regulatory practice.
Well, I think it's worth a lot more than 2 cents, at least to me. And so let me, what solutions have been proposed to minimize the impacts on low-income customers as more electrification occurs, raising gas prices for those who remain on gas, for example? And let me just sort of give a pitch. Is that also something that is a fertile area for people to investigate and to work on?
Oh yeah, I think that on the gas side, it is more than fertile. It's an area of great importance that I hope good minds will pay attention to, and good minds meaning people who understand the dilemmas that are going to happen for different communities, but also in terms of how to think about these changing dynamics that in sensible ways. I think part of it is that I would encourage people to start talking about those questions a lot. Right now, let's say on the gas side, there are places around the country where there have been local communities who have enacted bans on new gas hookups. I haven't seen something that says, everybody in our town has to actually switch over all their appliances. So that would be a next kind of phase of those mandates. But I don't know that we're keeping up as fast in thinking about how the physical character of the gas pipeline system, combined with the cost of service nature of regulation, and the fact that there are these income disparities associated with the ease with which people will be able to electrify. I don't have good solutions. It's a kind of problem that I think involves disciplines, multiple disciplines looking at this, including involvement of communities of color and equity folks. Right now, often regulators don't get the benefit of hearing a low income voice except from the consumer advocate, whether that's the Attorney General or some other consumer advocate. Finding ways to bring other communities in to talk about what are either rate designs or service packages that make it so that the service remains affordable. And everything I'm saying on gas, of course, is different on electricity, but as I said in the beginning of my presentation there are, 20% of the people are below the poverty line in terms of having unbearably high electricity and other utility rates. So that was a good way of me really actually avoiding answering your question, because I don't know the answer.
Well, which I think is part of the answer, that we don't know, and it's an opportunity for the folks who are attending the RTI to hopefully become participants in terms of being part of the solution.
Agreed.
So can you speak to the role of hydrogen and what role that might play in the future?
There is a lot of work going on to think about hydrogen and bring the costs of hydrogen production down. Right now, the analyses that I've seen don't anticipate that hydrogen is likely to be affordable or commercially ready for another decade at least. And then I think there are challenging market entry issues for that technology where it may be not fully utilized early on until there are transportation systems built out and a variety of other things. And so the financeability of commercial hydrogen projects, I think, are sketchy. Is that a technical word? Sketchy for a bit there. And so there's going to be chicken and egg problems early on. I do participate in discussions, though, where people say that having some kind of hydrogen enables a different kind of storage technology that could help on the electric system. And hydrogen could be a source of energy for a lot of different industrial purposes. And if it is developed through a clean set of technologies, then that may be a way to tackle some of the industrial pollution.
So those might be more centralized uses of hydrogen rather than a more decentralized use of hydrogen.
That's there could be both, of course. The centralized models are the ones that I hear most talked about by technologists.
Okay. Now, in terms of the adoption of technology and its effect on usage, have you seen a utility EV grid integration program where the reduction in coincident peak charging exceeds the increase in coincident peak charging the new EVs bring? Do you want me to say that one again?
I think I followed it.
Okay.
So if they all come in and charge at once, we got a big problem. If
Right.
they shift through batteries and load management, does it net out? I have not seen that study. That's another good one for somebody to do. It's a real important, it is a very important study to accomplish, and really needs to be accompanied by a lot of work that's certainly underway, but to figure out rate designs that really send proper signals, and also technology assists that work for the cycle of people's real lives, so that they are able to not have to do gymnastics in their own schedules to try to figure out how to do charging in a way that modulates those impacts. But a lot of work is really needed, and a lot of rate design adoption is very important for the regulators to be working on as well.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question, and I want to we'll go back to the low income issues. There seems to be a lot of interest in that, and I think appropriately so, and appropriate that it's growing, as is environmental justice in terms of concerns. So can you talk a little bit more about the role of low-income advocates and the limits of consumer advocates in electrification? And I would assume that it's the role of consumer advocates also in the regulatory process that determines the rules of electrification.
Yeah, in many ways, if you're like me and you're in more conversations these days with people from just transition communities, environmental justice communities, communities of color, they are so resource poor. And right now I'm talking about the associations or groups that might represent different constituencies who are interested in electricity rates or access to community solar or what have you. They as somebody said, they're doing their own Xeroxing, let alone having to go to all of these proceedings. They just can't, they don't have the bandwidth to do it. And they don't have the resources and technical assistance to provide it. So one of the things that I would encourage states to do in order to make discussions about electrification, discussions about rate design, discussions about how to design affordable packages, and how to pace some of these transitions so that you can maintain affordability for those who really need that kind of support. Let's figure out ways to help provide resources to these communities so that they can participate. Right now, many times they are foundation funded, and it's just a drop in the bucket of what is needed. So I would encourage a lot of creativity among state legislators in perhaps funding that, as well as commissions and energy offices to try to figure out how to facilitate inclusion in those processes.
Well, the state of California does have a process for funding of interveners, and I know that there's a wide variety of groups which are funded in that way for the participation
Yes.
in processes. It's the only state that I know of that does that. But maybe that's a good research topic for us at NRRI.
That's great. Yeah.
Or if anybody out there is interested in writing a paper on that, and we're happy to talk to you about publishing it. Well, this has been terrific. I want to thank you so much, and we really appreciate your participation today. And I also want to let folks know that Next week, you'll be back, and we're going to have a roundtable with a number of the speakers who've been participating in the class, and we'll be talking about what it's like to be a regulator. And happily, we have a wide variety of folks. Many, I think, we're both staff and commissioners. So, so we have
Great.
a great diversity of views, and we will be posting this and the rest of these webinars as quickly as we possibly can. It will be done shortly. So thank you again. I appreciate
Thank you.
your wonderful, wonderful talk.
Thanks, and thanks to everybody who hung in there. I appreciate it. Have fun.
Bye.
Stay well.
Yes, stay safe, please.